Tonight, breaking news on several stories as we come on the air. A dramatic takedown in the manhunt for 2 escaped killers. One shot dead. We're there tonight. Law of the land, American history as the Supreme Court rules same-sex marriage is legal in every state in the Union. Celebrations and weddings underway. Massacre at the beach, deadly terror attacks on 3 different continents. And tonight, NBC News has learned U.S. intelligence is bracing for a July 4th threat. And Amazing Grace, a rousing, extraordinary tribute in Charleston as President Obama leads a church of mourners in a wounded city in song and an unforgettable remembrance. A very busy night, and our coverage begins right now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening. Quite frankly, we haven't seen a news day this busy in a very long time. So many major stories were following the day, starting with a landmark decision by the U.S. Supreme Court making same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states. Emotional reactions across the country, marking a dramatic and historic shift in this country's social landscape, and a story we plan to have extensive coverage of tonight. But at this moment, there are breaking developments in the hunt for those escaped killers in upstate New York. We want to get right to NBC's Stephanie Gosk in Malone, New York. Stephanie, what's happened?
Good evening, Lester. This is an active scene in Malone right now. 2 senior New York officials tell us that Richard Matt has been shot and killed, but his sidekick, David Sweat, is on the loose in these woods. After a nearly 3-week-long manhunt and a jaw-dropping prison break, this could finally be coming to an end tonight. 2 senior New York State officials tell NBC News tonight that Richard Matt has been shot and killed 50 miles from Clinton Correctional Facility in the town of Malone, near Lake Titus.
We got one guy down.
Multiple law enforcement sources tell NBC News that Matt and Sweat were traveling close together when a Border Patrol tactical team encountered Matt and opened fire when he appeared to have raised a shotgun and pointed it at them. Authorities were conducting a sweep near Route 30 when they heard shots near a campground. After that, the team closed in on Matt. Evidence at the scene indicates that Sweat was nearby, and authorities say they are close to moving in on him. Officials believed they were getting closer to a capture, saying last weekend DNA evidence at a cabin near the small town of Owl's Head, New York, was a positive match to both convicts. We got an exclusive look at that cabin today, located 1.5 miles into the woods off the main dirt road called Wolf Pond Road. It's a hike up here, and Matt and Sweat would have had to come along this road. The question everyone has who lives here on their mind is, how did they know to make the turn back there? How did they know to keep walking? It's part of a hunting camp called Twisted Horn, which is owned by corrections officers. 3 of them work at Clinton Correctional, but the person who discovered the convicts works at another prison. The story is that the cabin owner came up here on his ATV, and he just had his dog and a gun, and he was coming to check the cabin. He looked through the door, and he saw someone move. Another positive DNA hit at another cabin today, authorities say, 13 miles north in Malone, near where Matt was shot tonight. It's been 21 days since the convicts' daring escape from the maximum security prison. The 2 cutting through walls and pipes, using a catwalk to get out, exiting through this manhole. Authorities have followed thousands of leads, zeroing in on the area near the prison.
We have no reason to believe they're in Canada yet.
The terrain has not made this an easy capture for law enforcement.
It's rugged, it's tenacious, the weather has not cooperated. It's probably been as much of a challenge to the inmates as it has been to law enforcement.
There are very few roads here in Malone leading to Lake Titus. They have all been shut down, and residents who are trying to get back to their homes are told it's just simply too dangerous to go through there now. Lester? Stephanie
Gosk in upstate New York, thank you. Now to that historic Supreme Court decision legalizing same-sex marriage across the land, and it's profound. The 5-4 vote in many ways reflecting the huge societal shift of the last 20 years. The president saying today there are days like this when that slow, steady effort is rewarded with justice that arrives like a thunderbolt. We'll have all the celebrations across the country and also hear from those left disappointed by the decision. But first, let's get to the court and our justice correspondent, Pete Williams. Pete, set the scene for us.
Lester, good evening. It's the most important gay rights ruling ever, and it's the culmination of decades of legal battles. It comes from a Supreme Court that just 30 years ago said gay people could be punished as criminals. A huge cheer, then singing as the decision reaches the crowd out front. The historic ruling struck down the bans on same-sex marriage still in effect in 14 states, all of them in the South and the Midwest. It was already legal everywhere else. Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote the 5-4 ruling, joined by the court's liberals. The right of same-sex couples to marry is part of the liberty promised by the Constitution, Kennedy said, which grants them equal dignity in the eyes of the law. After the decision was announced, the crowd seemed to grow, people wanting to celebrate and be closer to the Supreme Court. Couples who fought the bans in Kentucky were ecstatic.
It's been a long path for us in our 33 years. We know that people have been fighting this fight for decades.
Pam Yorksmith and her partner battled Ohio's ban.
For us, this started out as a dream to add my name to our son's birth certificate.
James Obergefell wanted to be declared the survivor on his spouse's death certificate.
I know in my heart that John is with me today.
Each of the Supreme Court's 4 conservatives filed a dissent. Chief Justice John Roberts said the couples made strong arguments rooted in social policy and fairness, but such a decision, he said, should rest with the people, not judges. Justice Antonin Scalia called the court's reasoning a threat to American democracy. If he had written the ruling, he said, I would hide my head in a bag.
And we hope that this decision today will not be used as an excuse to ostracize, to demonize, or to punish people for holding views contrary to what 5 of the 9 justices said today.
Massachusetts in 2003 was the first state to permit marriage for gay couples. Others followed slowly. Then a rush of court rulings in the past 2 years brought it to 70% of the nation's population.
People don't have to hold their breath as they cross state lines and worry they're going to lose their marriage and lose their protections as they do.
Today's ruling settles the issue of same-sex marriage nationwide. It could be undone, but only by a constitutional amendment or by a future Supreme Court that changes its mind, and neither of those seems at all likely. Lester?
Pete Williams, thanks. Across the country right now, wedding bells are ringing in Texas and Alabama and Georgia, places where some people thought this day might never come. Celebrations are underway tonight, and NBC's Hallie Jackson has all the latest.
From the Stonewall Inn in New York to San Francisco's City Hall, celebrations decades in the making, but perhaps none as meaningful as these. Same-sex marriage ceremonies in states where it was illegal before today, like in Arkansas.
Spouses for life.
And in Texas, where Jack Evans and George Harris finally wed after 50 years together.
We didn't want to rush into anything, but we're ready.
The paperwork was not quite, with the word woman still printed on the marriage license.
The time has come. Texas has finally caught up with history. Love rules.
Social media lit up with profile pictures turning to rainbows and 33,000 tweets per minute at its peak. Ellen DeGeneres writing simply, "Love won." And Tim Cook, Apple's openly gay CEO, calling it a victory for equality, perseverance, and love.
You wouldn't think that something so basic could take so long.
2 decades ago, only 27% of Americans supported same-sex marriage. Now, 60% do. But that shift is far less pronounced among Republicans. About 6 in 10 oppose the court's decision, according to our latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, with many Christians, especially in conservative parts of the nation, deeply unsettled.
It's not the will of the people to have same-sex marriage. Now there's no point in having civil marriage in this country whatsoever.
In Alabama, at least 2 counties are refusing to issue any marriage licenses, gay or straight.
This is a sad day for children, a sad day for our Constitution, a sad day for America.
For opponents of same-sex marriage, a blow from the Supreme Court. For supporters, a victory for equality and love. And in West Hollywood, which was one of the first cities in the country to publicly support marriage equality, thousands of people are expected at a rally tonight, Lester. And for many of them, it's the perfect way to cap Gay Pride Month.
All right, thanks very much. Another major story still developing tonight. 3 terror attacks today on 3 different continents playing out almost simultaneously in France, Kuwait, and Tunisia, where a massacre occurred at a beach resort popular with European tourists. And here at home, NBC News has learned tonight U.S. intelligence is bracing for a July 4th threat. We want to bring in Michael Leiter, former director of the National Counterterrorism Center, now executive vice president of the private security firm Leidos. Michael, ISIS has been calling for, quote, a month of disaster. Is that what we saw play out here, an answer to that call?
I think it largely was, Lester. And what this really showed is the diverse threat that officials face. You have the one in Kuwait, which is really driven by the Sunni-Shia divide. You have in Tunisia a less secure situation because of the Arab awakening. And then you have what strikes the greatest fear in U.S. officials' hearts, and that's the attack by the likely homegrown terrorists in France.
And we hear this perhaps a threat for July 4th that officials are going to be on the lookout for here. The nature of these kinds of attacks seem low tech. Is there a way to prevent them?
It's extremely difficult. The FBI has active investigations in all 50 states. These can come up from almost anywhere. So they are watching people they know about, but it's the ones they don't know about with guns, knives, or just a car that really does make them nervous. And July 4th is obviously a good target, even if there isn't anything specific that they're watching today.
Michael Leiter, thanks very much. And with more on today's attacks and the fears here at home, let's go to NBC's Kelly Kobiea.
The attack turned this Mediterranean beach resort into a scene of bloody horror. Bodies motionless in the sand. People rushing to help survivors, many of the wounded in shock. Eyewitnesses described utter panic.
We were on the beach sunbathing, right by the pool. All of a sudden, we hear shooting. I stand up and a guy drops an umbrella and out comes a gun. He starts shooting at everybody to the right of us. I got up and shouted, "Gun, run," and he then started shooting everybody around him.
And as I turned, the bullet just hit me in my arm.
One gunman was killed by police. At least 2 other suspects were taken into custody. The target, Tunisia's Imperial Marhaba Hotel, popular with tourists, including many from Germany, Belgium, and Great Britain.
Our hearts all go out to the victims of these appalling terrorist acts.
Just 3 months ago, an attack on Tunisia's National Museum left 20 dead, most of them tourists. Today's toll, at least 37. In Kuwait, another attack. A suicide bomber struck a packed Shiite mosque in the heart of Kuwait City. He blew himself up during Friday prayers. At least 27 worshippers dead, more than 200 injured.
Security in Kuwait is extremely tight. For this attack to take place at a Shia mosque in itself is extremely rare.
In France, a third attack. An American-owned gas factory outside Lyon. A man crashed his vehicle into gas canisters, triggering an explosion that injured 2 people. The severed head of the man's employer was found at the factory gate, with flags bearing Arabic inscriptions. The suspect, his wife, and 2 others were arrested. Just this week, an ISIS spokesman called on Muslims everywhere to rise up and make Ramadan a month of calamity. But were today's attacks coordinated?
We certainly know there's a common theme between all of them. And more importantly, this is what ISIS wants. ISIS has been calling on individuals, whether they're in Europe or in the Middle East, to carry out attacks of this scale.
One day, 3 attacks, and fears of more to come. Kelly Kobiea, NBC News, Tunis.
We've got a lot more ahead on a very busy news night, including a spirited tribute to the victims of the Charleston Church massacre, the once-in-a-lifetime sight and sound of a president breaking into song before an arena filled with mourners, inspiring them to become a chorus of thousands. The Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, as it looks tonight, just hours after thousands came together nearby for a moving memorial for the 9 people massacred inside last week. President Obama today paid tribute to the victims in his eulogy for Reverend and State Senator Clementa Pinckney. We were in Charleston as well this morning, speaking to some of the hundreds who lined up hours before the service, a diverse crowd who told us they were hoping for a message of unity from the president, who delivered with spirit and with song. Ron Allen continues to lead our coverage from Charleston.
The Reverend Senator Clementa Pinckney left his beloved Mother Emmanuel Church for the last time this morning, as thousands gathered in a nearby sports arena turned into a sanctuary because so many mourners wanted to say goodbye. President Obama, who met the pastor here during the 2008 campaign, led a delegation of national and state leaders.
We are here today
to remember a man of God who lived by faith, a man who believed there were better days ahead, off in the distance.
He praised Pinckney, a preacher at age 13, as an activist minister and political fighter as well, elected to the State House at just 23 and then the Senate. And Mr. Obama praised Pinckney's grace and saw that same goodness in the 8 who died with him.
Blinded by hatred, the alleged killer could not see the grace surrounding Reverend Pinckney and that Bible study group.
Mourners grieved throughout the city, families with children to witness history.
He did not forsake their teaching.
Watching the service at theaters, museums, the street in front of Mother Emanuel. The president's eulogy, also a call to confront tough issues, gun control, race relations, taking down the Confederate flag. An impassioned president, mindful of the history of the church, its pastor, and the moment, even leading the congregation more than 5,000 strong in singing an old hymn.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. God continue to shed his grace on the United States of America.
A very, very powerful moment, and many leaving that auditorium came here to Mother Emanuel, where the services continue. This evening, friends and relatives gathering to pay their respects to Cynthia Hurd, 54, a librarian who died with her church brothers and sisters. The funerals continue this weekend and on into next week. Lester?
Ron, you've been there this long and painful week. The president was there to give a eulogy, but clearly he was talking beyond that church. Did it seem to bring together and send the message that community was looking for?
I think it did, Lester. Politics aside, this week has been just so emotional, so disturbing, so uplifting as well. And I think the president was caught up in all that. It's impossible not to be standing in an auditorium with 5,000 people. And we also believe that he spent some good time with the families of those who lost loved ones here at this church. Just a profound week. We've seen a lot of things over the years. Just an absolutely profound experience.
All right, Ron, thank you. We're back in a moment with the sightseeing trip that quickly turned tragic for a group of tourists. A tragic turn of events for a group of cruise ship passengers who went out on a sightseeing trip on a small float plane, only to have it crash against a cliff in the wilds of Alaska. The pilot and 8 other people on board were all killed. All the passengers were from a Holland America cruise ship. The cause of the crash is under investigation. On a trip to Germany, Queen Elizabeth paid her very first visit to a former Nazi concentration camp. The Queen toured the grounds of the infamous Bergen-Belsen camp, where at least 52,000 people died during World War II, including Anne Frank. She also met with Holocaust survivors and British veterans who helped liberate the camp 70 years ago. When we come back, a week for the history books and what it means for our country moving forward. Tonight marks the end of a momentous week in this country, a week filled with events that altered the very fabric of our American culture. And while we often see these seismic shifts through different lenses, we have all become witnesses to history in the making over just a few days' time. Here's Harry Smith.
Sometimes the currents of history surprise us. From the tragedy in Charleston arose a movement that had long been stalled in an eddy of complacency.
Make this day the day that the flag comes down.
Suddenly, from state to state, the words rang out loud and clear, "Take down the flag." And this morning, the Supreme Court made clear that the rights of gay Americans are equal to that of everyone else.
Today's ruling from the Supreme Court affirms what millions across this country already know to be true in our hearts. Our love is equal.
A civil rights ruling that not so long ago seemed far-fetched. In an instant, the future was here, now. And yesterday, the court ruled the government does indeed have the right to subsidize health care for the poor.
Health care is not a privilege for a few, but a right for all.
Will the Affordable Care Act become this generation's Social Security?
Love wins!
What some embrace as progress, others will argue is egress. Our American family will always have its differences. Navigating change, though, is what makes us who we are. Harry Smith, NBC News, Charleston.
And our coverage continues now with several developing stories, including history made at the Supreme Court, a 5-4 ruling that same-sex marriage is a constitutional right, now legal in every state from coast to coast. The reaction was swift from the court to the campaign trail, and there's no one better to provide insight for us than our political director, the moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, and Pete Williams as well from the Supreme Court. And Chuck, let me start with you. This caps a week of wins for the president after his health care victory, a big victory on trade in Congress. How will this week be remembered when we assess his legacy?
Look, I think it's going to be potentially a transformational week. You know, when the president was running for president, he said he wanted to be like Ronald Reagan more than he wanted to be like Bill Clinton. And he made that point by saying Ronald Reagan was a transformational president because he shifted the entire country's agenda from, say, the center to center right. Well, I think when you look at everything that happened in social change this week, from just the trade deal to same-sex marriage, to the response to the Charleston shooting, you're seeing that potential transformational shift of the country that candidate Obama said he wanted to lead, and you're seeing that, and I think it's encapsulated in everything that has happened in this 10-day period.
And now as you look at the presidential campaign, especially in the Republican field, does it essentially take the issue out of play?
It does not take the issue out of play in the presidential primary season. In fact, if you looked at all of the responses from the Republican presidential candidates today when it came to the same-sex marriage decision, it was as if you got an MRI into how they viewed their best shot at becoming president or becoming the nominee. You had 4 candidates who absolutely wanted to appeal to evangelical voters who are angry about the decision today. Ted Cruz called it the worst 24 hours in American history, referring to this decision in health care. Judicial tyranny was a phrase that Mike Huckabee used. And so they're going to make a huge issue of this in the primary season. But you had other presidential candidates who think they might have a shot at beating a Hillary Clinton and getting into the Oval Office, who try to thread a needle. And they said things like they disagreed with how the court came to this conclusion, but they now say, like a Jeb Bush, essentially saying, you know what, this is the law, he respects it, it's time to move on. So that was what was fascinating to see. By no means is this issue politically going away, at least inside the Republican Party, at least this year.
And Pete, let me bring you into this conversation. We had some polling data in our first half hour showing how the American views on this subject have changed dramatically over the last 20 years or so. Does this ruling essentially mirror that?
And very much it does, but you have to remember that to some extent, while public opinion has moved very quickly, to some extent the Supreme Court's foot has been on that accelerator, because it was 2 years ago when the Supreme Court struck down the Federal Defense of Marriage Act that blocked the federal government from recognizing the validity of marriages, same-sex marriages in states where they were already legal. And that produced a huge change in the lower courts, one decision after another, as more marriages began to take effect as those state bans were struck down. So there's a sort of a mutual ratcheting up here of public opinion and legal developments.
And I'm wondering what it's like to be outside as that decision began to filter through the crowd. We saw some of the celebrations there.
Absolutely. Something I really haven't seen here in a long time. Up in the courtroom, when Anthony Kennedy was announcing the decision, some of the lawyers involved in the case, the couples who were involved in these legal challenges, began to cry. Now, frankly, this ruling, the outcome was not unexpected because of some of the Supreme Court's previous actions, but still, hearing it out loud was very emotional. Big cheer here. And then what usually happens down here when we get a big case is all the people that are here do their thing for a while, and then people start to trickle away. The crowd kept growing for much of today. There's still quite a few people here sort of standing around and looking at each other and celebrating. So that was very strange. And then one other odd thing happened. At one point, the court is very big on decorum. Nobody's allowed up on that marble plaza after the rulings are announced, and the crowd just sort of swelled up there. And I don't know if it was because there was no place else for them to go or they just wanted to get closer to the Supreme Court. It was a very, very unusual scene here today, Lester.
Put this in perspective of Supreme Court rulings. Are people going to remember this date?
Oh, without question, this will be a landmark ruling. It's certainly the most important gay rights ruling ever. But it's another, it exposes again the very deep divide on this Supreme Court on an ideological, fundamental question about interpreting the Constitution. You know, yesterday was all about reading in between the lines of a federal law, but this is the court's other line of work, interpreting the Constitution. And that's where you see these big fault lines between the liberals and the conservatives. With the liberals believing that same-sex marriage, there is a liberty right, that denying same-sex couples the ability to marry would deprive them of that liberty protection in the Constitution. The conservatives say that there is no right like this in the Constitution. So you see this very fundamental divide, but this one will be remembered for decades.
All right, Pete Williams, thank you for your perspective on all this. Celebrations underway right now, including at the place where the modern gay rights movement essentially began in 1969, the Stonewall Inn, now a New York historical landmark. Tonight, jubilant crowds in the streets in New York's Greenwich Village. That's where we find NBC's Katie Turr. Katie, what's it like out there?
It's pretty incredible out here. The crowds have been going since 10 a.m. this morning when the decision was announced. They are all the way down this block, and they are all the way down the opposite block. People just coming out to celebrate. You could say that this is the birthplace of the gay rights movement, decades in the making from this very point. 1969 is when cops raided this bar and set off protests throughout the city. Since then, gays and lesbians and their supporters have come here to celebrate every victory and mourn every loss. They were here in 2011 when New York State legalized gay marriage. They were here in 2013 when the Supreme Court overturned DOMA. There are so many stories in this crowd. I could give you a ton. We're going to get one right here from these gentlemen. You guys have been together for 16 years.
16 years.
Married for 3. What's this like?
No matter who they are.
It's incredible. I mean, in all the world, I think this is the place to be today, right now, in front of the Stonewall Bar in New York City.
And I've lived here for 42 years, right on the street, Grove Street. So it's just wonderful for it to happen right here in this neighborhood, which has always been so special to me. But it's even more special today.
You guys have had this right since 2011 in New York State. How do you feel about now being able to move to any other state in the union if you want?
Well, we probably wouldn't want to move to another state in the union, but it's nice to know that we could and that our marriage in New York will be recognized in any of the other states as well.
Yeah.
And it's important.
We're in the best place right here, Greenwich Village, New York, the most tolerant, wonderful, creative place in the world. So we're very happy to be here.
It's Gay Pride Weekend here in New York this weekend. Does it make it extra special?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, without question. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Just one of the many stories. We spoke with one person who said that they finally feel normal. Back to you, Lester.
Katie Turr tonight. Katie, thank you very much. We want to turn now to the other major story we've been following, the late-breaking developments in the manhunt for those 2 escaped killers in upstate New York. Tonight, one of those convicts has been shot and killed by law enforcement, and they are in hot pursuit of the remaining fugitive. NBC's Stephanie Gosk in Malone, New York. Stephanie, what's the latest?
Lester, WNBC, our New York affiliate, is now reporting that there has been a second gun battle, apparently between David Sweat and authorities. Now, that follows the first gun battle that left Richard Matt dead. Now, law enforcement officials have been describing to us how that first encounter occurred. It was a border tactical team that was here right on Route 30, and they heard what they thought was gunfire coming from one of the nearby campgrounds. When they went into the campground, they encountered Richard Matt with a shotgun. That's when they shot him. They found evidence there that David Sweat had been there with him, although they didn't get him in that moment, and then he has been on the run in these woods. And as a result, they have shut down these roads. They have surrounded this neighborhood. There are residents here that can't get back home because they've been told it's too dangerous. Lester?
Stephanie, at what point do they think these men became armed?
Well, it's a really good question, and it was their fear all along. They have been roaming these woods here in the Adirondacks for 3 weeks now, and in these woods are these cabins. We know they were in one of them, and what we don't know is whether or not there were guns there. Hunters, some of them, keep their guns in the off-season in some of these cabins. One can suspect that maybe that was where they picked up their weapons. We don't know for sure, but what we are realizing very quickly here is that they are as armed and dangerous as law enforcement warned us back when they broke out.
And Stephanie, you and other reporters have been up there for quite a long time. I know your vehicles are frequently searched. Talk about the nerve. Talk about the feeling of people who live there during all this.
It's been really tense for people. There have been people that we have found that have been putting their shotguns, and a lot of people have guns up here next to them when they sleep at night. There are campgrounds around here and summer camps for children. Some of those summer camps have actually delayed opening because of their safety concerns. And it's just been difficult to get around. It's really changed the lifestyle here for people. This is a sleepy summer vacation community, and this is not what they are used to. And what they are realizing tonight is that it could very well be coming to an end. It will bring a lot of relief for people who live here. All right, Stephanie Gosk, we appreciate your continuing coverage up there in that search. Still ahead tonight, it was both a eulogy and a call to action. The message the president delivered on guns, which some are sure to find controversial, before a crowd of thousands as they mourn the tragedy in Charleston together. I want to talk more now about those 3 terror attacks today. One in France, Tunisia, and Kuwait. Dozens of people slaughtered, and now late word of a terror threat here in the U.S. leading up to July 4th. NBC's Ayman Mohyeldin is here with us. He's covered the region extensively. Ayman, 3 deadly attacks today. Talk about the timing and the likelihood that these are somehow connected.
Well, they're certainly connected. If they're not operationally connected, at least thematically connected. We know that ISIS a few days ago, a spokesperson for the group, was very clear about this. He called on supporters of the group, sympathizers all around the world to carry out these types of attacks. And we're seeing that happen today. Now,
during this period.
During this period, and specifically during the month of Ramadan.
Right.
We're now in the first full week of the month. We still have 3 more weeks to go. And I think that's why it's a major cause of concern for U.S. officials as the major July 4th holiday is just around the corner.
The attack today in Tunisia, killing dozens of people there, gunmen coming up, shooting up a hotel area. You just came back from that region. They had suffered another attack on tourists just a few months ago.
Yeah.
What's the climate there?
Tunisia is the only country out of the Arab Spring countries that has been a success. It has also been a major target of ISIS for the past several months. They want to try to destabilize it as much as possible. The people in Tunisia are very much concerned about security and stability. They need tourism. It's a major part of their economy to survive. And that is why ISIS has now carried out 2 major terrorist attacks on tourists in the past 6 months. One on the National Museum, and today in this popular tourist destination.
People here look at that and say, well, it's over there, it's not over here. And then we hear that there's intelligence, or at least concern, of maybe some kind of a July 4th threat. Operationally, does ISIS have the capability, or they simply need to inspire a lone wolf?
Certainly need to inspire, and that's what they have done so well. If you look at some of the attacks that have happened in France, whether the Charlie Hebdo and other parts of Europe, there's no doubt that ISIS, through social media and its propaganda arm, have been able to connect with people here in the United States. We've seen that. We've heard that from law enforcement officials in some of the communities I've visited in the U.S. So there's no doubt that the U.S. officials, intelligence, security, very much concerned about this type of lone wolf inspirational attack. It doesn't necessarily have to be the spectacular attacks that we've seen in the past, the Al-Qaeda style attacks, but any lone wolf can create the kind of havoc that we've seen today, whether it's on a beach in Tunisia or outside the gates of a factory in France.
And we're reminded, Tunisia, the attack there, low tech. It was a gun.
Absolutely. And we've seen even attacks with knives. Knives can be just as deadly. And that is obviously the concern. They're not necessarily worried about the big car bombs or the suicide bombings like we saw in Kuwait, but they're more concerned about the individuals who may be trying to carry out this lone wolf attack like we saw in Garland, Texas.
Ayman Mohyeldin. Ayman, thanks. Those 3 attacks, of course, is part of what has been a very busy news day. We want to turn to one of the other major stories we've been following, the incredibly moving tribute in Charleston, South Carolina today for the 9 victims of the church massacre there last week. President Obama stunning the crowd by leading them in a rendition of Amazing Grace during his eulogy. But the president had more than condolences to give. NBC's Ron Allen has been leading our coverage in Charleston, and that's where we find him tonight. Ron, good evening.
Good evening, Lester. Yes, the president came here to deliver the eulogy for the Reverend Clementa Pinckney, the pastor of the Mother Emanuel Church. And he went much further than that. He called him a good man. He said he'd done so much for his church and his community. Then the president went in a completely different direction, saying that this was a time for the nation to confront tough issues raised by the massacre of those 9 churchgoers here last week. Issues like opportunity for all, the Confederate flag, race relations, and gun control.
For too long, we've been blind to the unique mayhem that gun violence inflicts upon this nation. Sporadically, our eyes are open. When 8 of our brothers and sisters are cut down in a church basement, 12 in a movie theater, 26 in an elementary school, the countless more whose lives are forever changed, the survivors crippled, the children traumatized and fearful every day as they walk to school. The vast majority of Americans, the majority of gun owners, want to do something about this. We see that now. And I'm convinced that by acknowledging the pain and loss of others, even as we respect the traditions and ways of life that make up this beloved country, by making the moral choice to change, we express God's grace.
The President spoke a lot about grace and goodness, something that he said he saw in Reverend Pinckney and the others who died with him. After the service, many came here to Mother Emanuel, where the services continue. And behind me, perhaps you can see there are people leaving the church now. There's been a wake and viewing for Cynthia Hurd, 54-year-old librarian who died with her church brothers and sisters. Out here in the streets, people are still gathering. It's somewhat somber, but more reflective and contemplative than downbeat, very upbeat. People coming together, a lot of unity that we've seen here all week, and people hope that that certainly continues in the days and weeks to come.
And it's a fairly diverse community, Charleston, and I was there this morning talking to folks in line wrapped around the corner to get into the arena today. How much has that city set an example for how to deal with these sorts of things and how to heal?
I think they've set a profound example. That's what so many people have said. The president said that himself, as have others who have come here. Just about every night out here, we've seen people gathering. And you can see over there that there's a huge wall of flowers that's in front of the church. Those flowers have been put there in the last 24 hours because they keep putting fresh flowers over there. So many people are coming, bringing offerings, cards, letters, candles. And they're bringing their children, too. We see a lot of families out here and a lot of conversations about what this all means. Lester?
All right, Ron Allen, thanks very much. In a moment, we're going to go live to Alaska and the story of 9 people who set out for adventure and instead they found tragedy. We're back now with a vacation excursion that suddenly veered into tragedy amid the beautiful but tough terrain of Alaska. 8 tourists leaving the confines of their cruise ship to take a sightseeing trip aboard a small float plane, a trip that they and their pilot would not survive. Our Joe Fryer joins us now from Ketchikan, Alaska, with more. Joe, good evening.
Good evening, Lester. The NTSB has arrived here in Ketchikan, but investigators won't even get to the crash site until tomorrow morning. They plan to spend at least 5 days here, making multiple trips in and out, trekking over some very difficult terrain as they try to figure out what went wrong. In the stunning yet rugged wilderness that surrounds Ketchikan, just getting to the site of the plane crash is a challenge for rescue teams.
It's going to be an arduous walk for the NTSB to get in once the rescue squad has secured the accident scene.
The float plane was carrying Holland America cruise ship passengers who were on a shore excursion when the aircraft crashed into the face of a granite rock. All 9 people on board were killed, the pilot and 8 passengers. The plane was operated by Promec Air. From the company's president, all of us share the pain and anguish of this terrible event. Ketchikan is a tight-knit community that relies on tourism from cruise ships. A tragedy like this impacts almost everyone.
Every person in town either has a family member or a friend who flies a plane, and so when something like this happens, everybody just holds their breath.
Around the time of the crash, FAA cameras show clouds were low and winds were whipping, but at this point investigators say it's too early to know why the plane went down. Rescue teams hope to recover all 9 of the victims by the end of today. Lester, so far their names have not been released.
Joe Fryer from Alaska tonight. Joe, thank you. When we come back, when mere words are not enough, emotions turn into song on the steps of the Supreme Court. Finally, tonight, we want to show you a moment of pure joy today when the word spread of the ruling from inside the Supreme Court to the majestic front steps just outside. The Gay Men's Chorus of Washington broke into song, singing the National Anthem in celebration.
Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave? Of the free and the home of the brave.
The Gay Men's Chorus of Washington just after 10 o'clock this morning on the steps of the Supreme Court. That's going to conclude our special hour-long edition of NBC Nightly News. Thanks for being with us. I'm Lester Holt, and for all of us at NBC News, thanks for watching and have a good night.